Well, we're back. Sorry the last week didn't happen. Maybe I'll make the 10 minutes of show that actually did recorded some sort of Patreon exclusive or something. It's not all that special, but we started
Yeah, only
the show.
Craig was there. That's why it wasn't special.
A bold assertion, but what
it
had
is
happened,
a bold assertion.
It is. But what had happened, I got my own little mini Texas experience a little bit further up here on the East Coast. So that crazy Arctic vortex, was it, that came through?
Polar vortex or whatever
vortex,
it is.
Yeah. Hit us here. It was 32 degrees and raining. So it rained and rained and rained all fucking day. And then it froze on everything and snapped trees and fucked everything up. Because if it had been snow, we can deal with snow here. We get snow, maybe not every year, but pretty regularly, so it's normal. But power went out for something like 100,000 people in my city, and there's still something like 30,000 out. They've had me back up since, Thursday afternoon or early evening? I'm not sure exactly. And that was an experience. So
even we were getting an ice storm up where we are.
Yeah, I'm made to understand that it was colder in parts of Texas than it was in Anchorage, which is
I believe it.
Well, it just goes to show you that we have got to defeat global warming because it is.
That's exactly right.
It's destroying us. Look at all that heat, and
well, now, don't forget though, right? It's only global warming during the summer. In the winter, it's climate change.
You'd think they'd just call it global cooling in the winter, since it's the winter anyway, and people would be able to
You
more
would,
easily
but
to it.
then you'd have to explain the whiplash. So instead, they just use global warming, or technically they use climate change in both cases. But
well, they do now
it is,
because you've got to do the whole. Well, why isn't it warming and the blah blah blah?
So for me, right, and here's where I stand. Like, they whine and they complain when skeptics point out the fact that half the country freezes in extreme weather every couple of years. And they sit there and they complain that skeptics point out that it's, frozen temperatures and mock global warming and the whole entire thing. They get all pissy about that. But every single time there's a friggin' heat wave or a fire or something like that, they want to claim global warming as the cause. So I feel perfectly justified in turning around and sitting there and using their same tactics against them.
Well, global warming actually caused Gavin Newsom to veto the bill that would have cleared the forests in 2018 and 2019 of debris and detritus that could catch fire if, like a PG&E utility happened to be running through the area and have a spark come off of it.
That's kind of the problem. That's kind of the problem that we have with climate change, or when you start talking to Craig and I. If you want to talk to the engineers, we'd be okay with passing the whole thing over and just being like, yeah, whatever. But there's two things that ends up happening. One, they use this as a call to do stupid things with energy policy and environmental policy. Climate change is always a stupid call to arms. Right? And the second is they use it as an excuse to kind of wash over really bad policy decisions that have resulted in massive damage and casualties in their state. So when we sit there and we start talking about things like the fires, it is 100% true that if it wasn't for Gavin Newsom, and it's not just Gavin Newsom, by the way, because this goes back about 100 years, if it wasn't for the left listening to the hippy dippies who don't want us to go through the forest and clean up the trees in a desert, because that's what California is, it's a fucking desert, then we wouldn't have the fuel load, which is what causes the massive fires every year. So because we don't do controlled burns, and because we don't allow, mass harvesting of trees, we aren't thinning out this forest in an area. And what a lot of people don't know is the Pacific is actually known for this. The whole Pacific coast operates with a different series of flora and fauna, which are more flora, but that are tied to the actual fire cycle. That whole area depends, as part of its natural cycle, of burn. And we have done burn suppression to protect homes in an engineered landscape for decades, which has caused problems. And then we're not sitting there and clearing out that fuel load into the future, which means that instead of sitting there and dealing with the problem as it comes up, we let it build up and it causes major issues. Or, in the case of Texas this past week, Texas has a problem where they're not really properly winterizing their machines. And, they happen to rely on unreliable energy. That's a significant portion of their grid costs. And the consequence of relying on unreliable fuels and energy is that you basically if anything changes from your norm, you aren't prepared for it. So when we start talking...
Well, let me break in here. Are you saying that wind turbines that are designed to function in Texas don't work in Arctic temperatures?
They generally don't.
There's a whole, that seems counterintuitive to me for some reason. Maybe it's just my cat brain.
Well, it's not just that. I mean, one of the problems that you have with renewable energy, right, and you can take a look, I posted a link in here to the EIA. Renewable energy is not dependable on an everyday basis. It's not like nuclear, which is reliable 96% of the time. Right, a nuclear reactor just runs in perpetuity for 3 years at a whack.
Short of like geothermal, require some sort of battery to be able to be relied upon.
They have to have, and it's not. Let's not go with battery because we do not use batteries to back up our renewables. Right now, we use fossil fuels to back up our renewables. And going back to I'm a nuclear guy, right? Climate change does nothing but benefit the argument for nuclear energy. So why am I a skeptic of climate? Because they sit there and they start pushing things like wind turbines and solar, right? And when they start pushing things like wind turbines and solar, they don't talk about the fact that you have to build an entire other power system and power network in order to keep these things online. So what ends up happening is when we start talking about something like solar, on a nice, beautiful June day, you get something like 33% of the nameplate installed capacity of the solar generator, right? It is generating for 8 hours at peak conditions under ideal conditions in the summer. In the winter, however, the expected capacity drops to 10 to 12%. Which means that if you wanted to run a grid off of solar, and by the wind drops down similar levels. I think it's 15, 16% in the winter. So if you wanted to run a renewable energy grid, you would have to you'd have to overbuild your capacity by a factor of 3 in order to run, and actually probably more than that because we use more energy to stay warm than we do to, run our air conditioning. Our air conditioning units are actually technically more efficient. They're like pure heat engines, which are optimally designed. So, if we wanted to sit there...
I'll include a link to, as crazy as he has gone since then, Thunderfoot does do some really good stuff. I'll have a link to his Solar Roadways Busted thing that really really well digs into this.
So when we start talking about these energy technologies, if you wanted to run a society on wind and solar, and you wanted it to rebuild your capacity...
Lost you there for a second.
Yeah,
wanting to run things on solar and wind.
If you wanted to run things on solar and wind, you are going to have to overbuild your capacity, all of which raises costs, and none of those are included in what's known as the LCOE calculations. And the LCOE calculations are basically, if I build a unit and I sell every ounce of power that it is actually going to produce, what is the price of that unit of energy, right? So if I put a solar panel out there and I don't have to worry about any of the other externalities associated with operating a solar panel, how much does it cost? And that's pretty cheap because I don't have to do much for a solar panel. However, if all of a sudden I was to build a solar system that needed to power all the homes in Texas or West Virginia or New York at all points in time in the year, then I need to start taking into account things like the weather and night. And as soon as you start having to do that, you'd have to basically build 3 times as many solar plants, at least, for the day, right? So just your day-night cycle, because you only get 8 hours at peak efficiency in the middle of June. So you'd have to build 3 times as many solar plants, most of which aren't actually producing any power. They're just producing power for the time that you're down. And then you'd have to increase that cost by another factor of 3 to account for the difference between winter and summer. So what's going to end up happening is all of these units are not going to be producing every single unit of power, because we don't need all of the units of power that a solar grid system could produce in the middle of summer. We would need to have a whole bunch of spare units that just basically dump their electricity into the ground, so that when it comes time for us to hit winter and their efficiency drops down to a third of what it is in the summer, we can still use them. And so when we start talking about the actual calculations for these things, the actual cost associated with running a solar system is significantly more expensive. The other thing that we don't account for is the backup of these systems. So realistically, what ends up happening is we have to build an entire other power plant in order to keep our solar power plants online. So what's going on in Texas is basically, the system working as intended. And unfortunately, there's a whole bunch of people who have to suffer in this circumstance. And so one of the things that you start talking about is, why is it that Texas is out of power? Well, there's 2 reasons for that. One is that they basically run their own. There's 3 major energy grids in the United States. One is Texas, and then there's basically the northeast, or the eastern grid, the western grid in Texas, right? One problem that Texas has is that it's not really connected to the other grids. It's kind of somewhat isolated as its own separate special grid. They can buy external power if they need to, but it's very expensive. Now, when the wind turbines are working, they're able to take a significant portion of their power from wind, because they actually have great wind resources, right? And we have to count for that as our build-out goes on. One of the reasons that Texas built heavy into wind is not because of anything other than they have a huge amount of open land, which has a really great air channel that blows through it, and they generate a ton. They're able to generate a lot of power from that. So as one thing to note is, as the future advances in terms of wind and solar, we get less optimal spots. So that cost curve is going to actually increase over time. But they basically sat there and said, okay, well, if we have this much power coming in from wind, we're going to have this much power coming in from coal and natural gas to balance the load. And that's what we're always trying to do with these grids, is we're trying to balance the load. And so what ended up happening is the U.S. EPA, in particular under Obama, passed a rule that said that you are only allowed to balance the load during basically predicted off times for wind and predicted off times for solar. They have a priority purchasing arrangement, which allows them to operate in a lower cost capacity than other sources, because they basically, if you have to buy energy, you have to buy it from solar and wind first if it's available. And when we start talking about things like what's going on in Texas, they can't ramp up their production because the law states that based on their predicted capacity for this period of time, they're expecting wind to have X amount of output, and therefore they cannot produce gas or coal or any other reliable source of energy to compensate during that period of time, because it would be competitive with wind and solar. So now what's going on is Texas is having to deal with the fact that they don't have any power because the wind isn't turning, because the turbines froze, because a whole bunch of people didn't properly weatherize them, and because...
Well, that's actually a really good segue into something I was wanting to talk about, because, and we hadn't talked about this before the show, so I've got a friend in Texas that I've been talking to over the last week that's been dealing with all this. Somebody, basically just a normal online kind of shit poster kind of person, but has been, just watching things happen and taken some of it into account, stocked up on a bit of food, stocked up on a bit of water, and found out, wow, I had no idea I was so prescient to do these things. So what's happened in Texas there, specific to that, is that they were given, much like my previous example of California, they were given an option just over the last couple of years. ERCOT, I believe, was given the option to winterize, but basically as a cost-saving measure, even though they were expecting these things to occur based on their climate change models. They went ahead and, as their cost-saving, or we should say cost-benefit analysis told them, don't bother to winterize. It wouldn't have even been a very large cost.
Well, it's not, this is not predicted by climate models, right? Climate models don't have the granularity to say that X weather storm is going to have at X period of time and you're going to only have some sort of things. What is,
you get what I'm saying, though, based on the models they were expecting.
Right. So based on modeled wind output, they're going to have tail scenarios, and tail scenarios are the unlikely scenario. And there's going to be a tail scenario for you produce so much ungodly amounts of power that you basically blow the grid up, and that's not a problem for, nuclear, gas, or coal, because that doesn't happen, because we can control those plants. But for wind, for anything that's got a significant contribution from renewable energy, we can't, because they produce when they produce, and they don't produce when they don't produce. So they're going to have a tail end scenario, which is you have an ungodly amount of excess energy. And in that scenario, they basically dump it to the ground, so it's not a crisis, except for the poor little worms who are getting electrocuted. The alternative is that you're going to produce really, really low amounts of power. And in this case, that's what they're running into. Now, they tried
and more often than not, from what I understand as well.
Well, I mean, that's part of renewable energy, right? That's the risk you take when you don't have a clean, well-developed system, right? If you want cheap renewable energy, it's not going to be reliable. If you want reliable energy cheap, it's not going to be renewable. That's kind of the problem that you face, right? So you can do this with nuclear. You can pull this off and have no problems, and we'd all be sitting here and laughing about the fact that there was a winter storm out, and the worst thing that they'd be dealing with is the accident on I-35 from a few days ago. But the problem that they're having now is a whole bunch of people are starving, they have no water, and they can't heat their house because they've decided to rely entirely on wind turbines.
Well,
and that is something that will happen.
Well, not only that, also we have to consider that they have not decided, but their betters have decided that a certain way of running electricity is the only way. Meaning that due to Department of Energy regulations, as you said, from the Obama-Biden era.
Is it DOE? I thought it was EPA.
Well, the Department of Energy blocked this, but it's based on EPA findings or whatever. I don't know the political minutia of it, but the DOE is responsible for what's happened here, because there was a specific request sent in. Greg Abbott saw things coming, and he said, "Hey, I need to ramp up production," and they said, "You can fucking freak."
Well, that goes back to the fact that we have a federal law that requires us to buy power from unreliable sources before we can buy it from, any other source. And so the idea is that basically what ends up happening is it's very expensive to balance the load in these grids. So when the first problem that they ran into was the cost of renewable energy. So they couldn't get any renewable energy deployed, so they subsidized the cost. Then they had the problem that nobody actually wanted to buy energy from them because, well, it's really hell on the grid. You basically, imagine a dude running around. It's not this ridiculously low tech, but imagine a dude running around and trying to hit a whole bunch of knobs and dials and trying to balance, turning on and off gas plants and coal plants in order to sit there and deal with the fact that a cloud just moved over a whole bunch of your solar grid, or the wind just stopped blowing, right? And it's unpredicted. Now, some of these things are predictable in advance, but realistically, weather predictions are only predictable in advance for like 2 or 3 days.
Of freezing cold without power should not be subjected to skyrocketing.
Stupid New York Times. But, yeah, we should get into this, because there was a guy that was charged. When his power did stay on, he was charged $16,752. So that kind of goes into this whole
That's
thing.
the problem that you have if you want to violate the waiver, if you want to exceed the if you want to produce energy that is in excess of what the government has told you you can produce, because they're trying to allow solar and wind to be competitive, whereas they wouldn't be otherwise, because it's expensive. It's really expensive to try to keep the grid stable when you toss in wind and solar, and that expense goes up the larger proportion of the grid they actually generate in. So what's ended up happening is they've had to kick on, and a lot of these plants kick on automatically as part of the programming from the grid. And so now they're violating DOE orders, and DOE orders and EPA orders, and that results in costs of, I think it was $1,500 per megawatt hour is what they're charging Texas right now, which is about $1.50 a kilowatt hour.
Yeah,
that is ridiculously
excellent thread on that, and it's completely unbelievable.
It is 10 times your normal power bill cost is what it costs you to have unreliable energy in your state. If shit hits the fan, unreliable energy costs you 10 times what your normal power grid would cost. Oh, plus the fact that it actually costs 20, 30% more to have it in your state at a very low level anyways, because of all of the other special considerations that they have to get from the grid. But, yeah, that's what's going on with Texas. We put up wind turbines, and now we're paying the price.
Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but yes, that is very much a part of the problem.
I mean, the difficulty is there's no real way to balance that, right? Like, if you want to start talking energy storage, there's a whole you'll see, if you want to start looking at energy storage, you'll see a half dozen different companies that are trying to get in on the game of energy storage, but none of them can do it cheaply, and it is really, really hard. What makes energy storage hard is the fact that you need to be able to deploy it immediately when it's necessary, and there's just nothing that can really spin up that quick. Right, so whether maybe you think you're going to do it by storing large blocks of granite, let's say, right? Maybe you can do that. That's a proposal. That's a proposal of that. The only problem is you're only going to have a maximum number of blocks. You're going to basically, in this case, you're going to have a standard number of cranes lifting a standard number of blocks to handle this kind of energy load. And when this kind of situation hits, you're going to need to basically deploy all of them. And the other problem that you have with these energy storage systems is they deplete. So if you get a severe storm like this, it depletes very quickly, and then all of a sudden you're done. It's not so bad if you need an immediate call. It's very bad if you have a long, prolonged period. One of the only solutions that we have to energy storage that's relatively low cost and fairly effective is hydroelectric. And the cheapest envisioned grid of the future would be nuclear and hydroelectric. There's actually a study out there that proves this. And they pull this off because hydro is one of the few sources that can spin up almost immediately. In fact, if you go to something like the Grand Coulee Dam or any of these other major hydro stations that we have, particularly out west, you can actually go in there and they'll tell you that they get 1,000, they'll get 100 to 1,000 requests per minute for increased power, and all they do is just turn the turbines on and off because it's automatically load balancing. It's a very, very simple system. Everything else requires a lot higher cost because you have to basically build the storage out. You want to do something like batteries. The problem with batteries is that requires a whole bunch of rare earth metals, which is very, very expensive, and you get dielectric breakdown when you do batteries.
And never minding the toxicity of the environment of mining up these metals and processing them into usable materials either.
Right. I've seen some proposals that are, hey, we can use pressurized air. That's a great idea. The only problem is you're going to have to build caverns and caves that are capable of doing that without collapsing on themselves, bearing that pressure and handling that kind of an air change. And that's not cheap to do.
And just to clarify, too, on what exactly happened there based on the regulations, the power supply in Texas was required to operate at 60% capacity to reduce emissions. They had the capacity to run at peak efficiency, but they were not allowed a waiver by the Biden government.
Well, so you are always, in every state's case, in every grid's case, you're always going to have to build the equivalent amount of power needs you have in like gas plants and coal plants and nuclear plants. You don't get away from that. Because when you need power, you have to be able to produce it. Yeah, so what ends up happening that's the world of the future too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
You are always going to have plants that can reliably turn on and produce power. Because the two things that we expect with electricity, right? We hit that light switch and the power comes on, and we hit that light switch and it doesn't explode in our face. Those are the two requirements we have for energy. So we will always have stations that can actually produce that on basically 100% reliability basis, right? The problem that you have when you start introducing things like unreliable energy into this whole entire mess of situations is that it is determined by the weather. It does vary by the weather, and we don't really have a really good energy storage system to account for that. And this is a perfect example of really the worst case scenario. So if you ever wanted to get to 100% solar or 100% wind or any of these other things that you think are these great dream pipeline energy sources, you would have to build this much in batteries and this much in wind to account for these scenarios where it is actually low. Whereas if we build something like a nuke plant, we just have to build the nuke plant. We don't have to build this excess capacity in order to handle the fact that the temperature goes out. And, if you want low carbon sources, you're never going to get away from nuclear or hydro or any one of these other things that can actually turn on and just produce power when they're needed. The best you're going to be able to do is get away from gas peaker plants, which is how they handle balancing the load right now.
Well, maybe tidal stuff. Some of the new tidal wave generation technology, maybe. But, I mean, that's kind of another version of hydro, so.
It is, and I've seen some other really great ideas for sticking stuff into, the Gulf Stream. You could embed a turbine at the bottom of the ocean. And one of the great things about, these kinds of power sources as opposed to wind is the actual energy you get from rotating the blade is dependent upon the carrier fluid that it's in, the density of the carrier fluid that it's in. So air isn't particularly dense, so you need a hell of a blade. You need a hell of a blade. You need a really big long blade in order to get the force that you need to turn the turbine in order to generate the energy. You can do that with smaller blades at lower speeds in water turbines. The only problem with that whole process is sorry about that. That's my washing machine. I don't know what's wrong with it. I gotta fix it.
No worries.
The only problem with that process is that I'm not so sure I would want an army of tidal generators and I would want an army of tidal generators and natural current turbines interfering with the flow of our oceans, right? If we started turning around and dumping a whole bunch of turbines in the middle of the Gulf Stream, that sounds like it would be really cool, but it's also going to disrupt the Gulf Stream. And so we're all no longer...
It's going to pull some energy out of it.
It's going to pull energy out of it. And that's actually one of the things we've noticed with wind turbines is when you have enough wind turbines in an area like Texas, you actually start heating the planet because convection is a primary method of energy transfer. And as soon as you start sitting there and taking some of that convective energy out, all of a sudden these areas are basically having a heat buildup in them with the wind turbines and with the other stuff. So what actually has been found is that climate change will be exacerbated by renewable energy as opposed to, alternative sources.
Did you hear that, Greta? I don't think she heard us.
I don't think so, but let me grab you some papers on that because they actually did that, and it's really cool. I'll link those in chat.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll put those in for anybody that wants to follow up on this because it is a really interesting argument. Above and beyond, being a champagne socialist and flying everywhere in your Gulfstream, because it's more important that you be able to fly there in a Gulfstream because you're more important.
Well, there's other issues here too, right? One of the things that kind of bothers me when we start talking climate change is we don't really have a good accounting for energy. So we start talking about these things where we do something rapid and drastic like COVID. We just massively cut the overall energy consumption, not just of the United States, but the entire world. And a small variance in that amount of energy. So all of the energy that we use, whether you're using it to heat your house or to light your world, it will eventually be given off in the IR spectra or as heat. And I really am curious as to whether we have accounted for in our climate change models, because it's going to proxy CO2, by the way, because that's been our primary generator source. I'm really curious if we are actually sitting there and accounting for the energy produced by human civilization in the granularity that we need to start seeing these things. So one of the reasons we may have these exacerbated weather conditions, for these cold weather conditions, which are really just massively impacting the United States, is the United States has largely been in lockdown. Maybe not Texas specifically, but that's going to impact the entire thing. And so if you do a crude calculation, the purported amount of energy that's being released or absorbed by the atmosphere per radiative physics is substantially less than the amount of energy that is normally released as part of human operations. I think it was 10 to the 18th was what my crude calculation had versus 10 to the 16th. Where there's almost 100-fold increase in actual energy output from just running the world, as opposed to what's being put out into the atmosphere with some of the more specific claims that they've made over the past. So if you have a 5 to 10% variance in that, and that's the estimation is somewhere around 7%, is the reduction in energy consumption around the world as a result of COVID. How much of an impact is that going to actually have on overall, not necessarily global temperatures, but certainly global temperatures as it affects weather?
That's just, well, I don't really have the knowledge to speak on it.
I mean, that's one of those interesting tidbits. When we start talking about climate change, climate is an inherently chaotic system. It's actually a really cool thing to study, and I understand why people want to study it. But to turn around and assert wholeheartedly that it is caused by one thing and one thing alone, rather than a variety of things coming out of an ice age, is, I think, very detrimental.
Well, it's also kind of foolish to discount any kind of cycles as well. You know, historical.
Well, yeah.
I mean, we can look at the ice layers and see that there have been significantly different times in our climate history.
Well, and even more so than that, one of the questions that we need to ask is how many these models tend to assume that we're at a so this is kind of engineer speak. We assume in our models that pre-industrial Earth was at steady state operations, right? It was perfectly balanced at that time, and that everything that we've done since then has offset that balance. The only problem is that we have an atmosphere which is bounded by two major thermal output sources. One is the Earth's core itself, and that's always going to be heating the oceans, and it's always going to be heating the atmosphere. And the second, and I haven't seen any of that in any of the energy calculations and energy balances that we've looked at. They only look at the solar balances. Really? So there should always be, that's something that I've noticed. I actually did the math out once.
Incredibly short-sighted.
I've done the math out in terms of energy released per unit area of the surface area of the sea, and it very closely matches what's being reported as the amount of energy that is being absorbed by the oceans per climate change. Whenever climate is no longer affecting the atmosphere, it all immediately magically goes to the ocean, and that value comes to be very close to what the power output of the world's geothermal capacity is, if you actually do the math out. So one of the things that we are not accounting for is I don't think we're accounting for these energy balances that are external to the climate system. And so we assume that the climate system was perfectly balanced before, and now it's just CO2, whereas another alternative possibility is that it wasn't balanced before, and because it wasn't balanced before, all we're really seeing is the general imbalance that has been going on for a long period of time, and basically we're warming up out of an ice age over a very long period of time, and we haven't properly accounted for that.
Well, I mean, it's like blaming a new ice age on, human beings for that same, or the original ice age for that matter, on human beings.
Mm-hmm.
Or however many previous ice ages there may have been in the cycles of this planet's past.
Well, it's a flashlight problem, right? You shine a flashlight on the problem, you go, aha, I found the problem. But all you can see is what's in that beam of that flashlight. So if we've limited our scope to just being human activity in terms of atmospheric emissions, then all we're going to see as a result is human activity as a result of atmospheric emissions, which is one of the reasons why we probably have these discrepancies between our empirical observations and our models.
Yeah, not to mention, our information is generally not that good going all that far back on climate. I mean, all we've got is just some ice cores and, really only information for maybe 100 years that's actually good. Maybe 2.
Right.
So it's a little, what could you say? It's a little presumptuous to kind of think that we can pull
proxy records. The only problem is that proxy records are not particularly accurate, right? So they've got a certain resolution, and if we are outside the period of that resolution, and most of these records, in order to get sediment levels to settle out and kind of solidify to the point where you can actually use that as a layer for your ice core for your estimates, or ice and an ice core estimate, or any one of these other proxy data, it typically takes a few hundred years, which is one of the reasons why they use tree rings, because tree rings are basically based on an assumption of every single year. The only problem is the tree ring correlation with climate breaks down in the 1940s and 1950s, or 1950s and 1960s. Can't remember where. It's Michael Mann's nature trick, where they just basically lopped off the data because it didn't show what they wanted it to show.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So that actually happened, where for whatever reason we know that the tree rings stopped correlating at a certain point. And we don't know why. We have no idea why they stopped correlating at a certain point, but most of the other proxies that we use tend to be very, very long-term estimates, 100, 150 years of data compressed into a year. So anything in the last 100, 150 years where we've kind of had temperature estimates, but we haven't really, is not going to be properly captured or correlated, and we can't really use that to talk about the year-on-year changes that we normally see.
Well, that's fair. A pretty reasonable breakdown of how it's going. So, that being said, the Biden administration has blood on their hands, because the environment is more important than human lives, so it seems.
Well, it's always kind of how they operate. That's the problem with. This is the fundamental issue with sitting there, and when you start talking about why is it that people get upset with trying to sit there and fix the environment, it's that it seems to be that we can either have human success or we can have environmental success, whereas engineers look at it as, why can't we have both? And that's what we designed to.
I was thinking about just making a standalone video on the topic, but I'll just kind of expand on it right now because it's a perfect time. I mean, if things are in such a great danger, if we've only got, what was the last one, 12 years now?
Mm-hmm.
Never mind that they said that a couple years ago and it hasn't changed. Or that it was 20 years ago in the 90s, and, oh, right, it's not the teens. But, anyway, never minding that, I mean, if we've only got this limited amount of time and this small window to fix things, why in the ever-loving fuck would we not be putting our foot to the floor? Why would we not be accelerating our technological advancements to the farthest limits they could reach to try and fix the problems, as opposed to put a Band-Aid on a bullet wound, you know? It's the most ridiculous concept. If you've got a problem, why don't you try and fix it? Why are you going to just try and mitigate it and pass it off to the next generation in all essence? I mean,
well,
that's
utter
actually foolishness.
That's actually one of the reasons why, when you start talking about why is it that I deviated from the progressive and liberal path, right? Nuclear energy is a solution. We had it. We've had it for 50 years, 60 years now. Actually, 1940s, so what's that, 80 years?
Yeah.
We've had this stuff. And certainly there have been mistakes along the way. That happens. But, I also, where I come from, a pen ink factory exploded. So does that mean that we should end writing and reading because, a pen ink factory exploded? No, of course not. We learn from the mistakes. We improve the next generation. We're always going to have this cycle of improvement, and there's always going to be things that could go wrong. But for all intents and purposes, when we start talking about climate change, it is a solved problem. We have a solution. It doesn't require these radical alterations of our infrastructure. It doesn't require a significant shift in how we operate our economies. All we have to do is implement the technology that we have already solved for, and maybe sit there and start working on some newer things that we know will work.
Well, yeah, I was talking about that with some friends recently. I mean, if, as you put it, if we put the money into fusion necessary to fund it, we would have had it some time ago.
So what people don't know, and I think I've linked this chart before. If not, I can go find it again. So back in the 1960s and 70s, shortly after, we basically turned around. So in the early states early understanding of quantum physics, the development of nuclear reactors, of nuclear energy happened between the 1920s and the 1940s, right? We know of the dropping of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs, but it wasn't like born out of nothing. We didn't have this whole consciousness. It was a massive research project that involved tons of physical scientists taking 100 observations. Well, so we basically solved the nuclear problem in the 1940s. We then started transitioning, say, okay, it's good, we know how to blow up the world. How do we put this to use for humankind in a good way, in a positive way, right? And so this was atoms for peace. It was building nuclear reactors because we could have this clean energy solution, and it is fundamentally the bedrock of the mistakes that the Soviet Union made under communism that created the Chernobyl incident, because nuclear energy is by far safer than any other form of power, and they decided to skimp on reactor design. And so they blew one up because, God knows, they're Soviet communists, and that's how the communists operate. But what ends up happening in the 1960s or 1970s, they basically said, hey, we've done pretty good with fusion, or with fission, right? Nuclear, we know how to split the atom. We know how to split the atom reliably. We know how to harvest that energy. We know how to control the waste. We know how to handle the reaction and the products and all of the downsides. We understand the risks. We understand the benefits. We can do this in a controlled fashion. We have sat there and managed to create, in probably the harshest environment that exists, which is underwater, self-sustaining biomes that keep life support systems and the whole bit to work in submarines. That's what we really are. Is they're basically underwater spaceships, if you want to look at them the right way.
Sure.
Right? We know this technology works. We know this works in 100,000 different ways. How can we make it better? And the answer is that same. It is fusion, right? And people don't understand fusion and why it's such a big deal. One, uranium is a lot more limited than hydrogen. Hydrogen is like 75% of the universe. We can pull hydrogen from almost nothing. And on top of that,
hydrogen is kind of everywhere and kind of in almost everything.
Pretty much. When we started talking, one of the things we talked about before the show ever aired was the fundamental thing that makes nuclear physics works is how you work as a human being. Realistically, when we go in from a chemistry or biology perspective, we look at our chemical reactions that we're having, our biological reactions, what keeps life moving, right? And that's no different than the nuclear physics, right? It is a very, very tiny amount of mass change between a bonded state and an unbonded state in the things that we derive energy from. And that tiny little mass change is what produces chemical energy. And nuclear energy is no different. The only difference is that on a per nuclide or per reaction basis, the amount of mass change is significantly different. So roughly, I think it's, don't quote me on this, I'd have to go back to one of my other lectures. It's roughly about 1 million times more energy is contained in a single nuclear reaction as is contained in a single chemical reaction. Right, because the mass change is in a chemical reaction between the nuclides of reference is in the 10th decimal place of the mass of those elements. So for all intents and purposes, we can consider them positively affected. 10th decimal place. It's like the second or the third decimal place for a nuclear reaction. And that is a significant amount of mass that is burned. Now, when we start talking about hydrogen and the binding energy that gets released when we start doing hydrogen fusion, it is 4 times greater than the amount of energy that we get from nuclear fission, roughly. It's just because, so we have the most abundant compound in the universe, right? And we get 4 times more energy than something we really know how to do. So nuclear fusion was the promise of the future, right? On top of that, there's no waste. If I fuse 2 deuterium isotopes together, that is a great, wonderful thing. We produce a stable helium isotope, and helium is something that we can barely manage to keep a hold of. So I can actually sell that on the back end.
We're actually running out of it.
We not only sit there and solve our energy crisis if we go to fusion energy, but we solve our quantum physics testing material crisis by going to fusion energy. We stand to do nothing but gain immensely from it. And so in the 1960s and the 1970s, the DOE prepared a slideshow, and they said, basically, if you give us X amount of money, we can achieve fusion in 10 years. If you give us Y amount of money, we can achieve fusion in 20 years. If you give us Z amount of money, we can achieve fusion in 30 years. And if you give us anything less than this amount of money, we will never achieve fusion because we will literally not be able to fund the research that goes into it. And you know what the U.S. funded it at? Less than the amount of money that would produce no fusion result ever.
So we are $50 in a Denny's gift card.
Yeah, that's about right. Now, here's the kicker. Fusion looks like it's on the way in regardless of how little we've funded it, regardless of the fact that the DOE hasn't put money in, regardless of the fact that the U.S. military hasn't put money in. And that is because there have been such significant advances in material science, in particular in terms of electromagnets and electromagnetic materials, that we're starting to actually get closer and closer and closer to producing the magnetic confinement that we need to contain the plasma in order to induce the appropriate reactions. Now, I still kind of think that a tokamak, which is your big-ass donut of plasma, is a stupid design because it's like rubbing 2 sticks together in the woods to make fire. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of work every time you need to create fire. I like the match approach, right? And the problem that you have with the other alternative that we've been producing, which you actually, if for anybody who's a fan of The Expanse, this is the method that they use in their reactors. They actually physically show it. But it's a laser firing on a fuel pellet inducing fusion, which would basically be like lighting a match and then trying to light as many matches as you can, as fast as you can to try to do it. So we need something in between that. And there's other types of reactors which are coming out and being proposed, which are basically a combination of particle accelerator plus plasma confinement, which would allow the particle accelerator to ignite a reaction within the plasma confinement, which was my idea, but apparently it wasn't that unique because there's a whole bunch of other people doing it. We are also getting significant advancements in actual, the material science. So we're having things like the stellarator. I think that's what it's called. But it's basically a modification to the toroid shape. Toroid, by the way, for those of you who don't know, is a donut. Literally, it looks like a donut. So the stellarator actually modifies that so it kind of looks like a weird Mobius strip type thing. And that will allow, that is predicted to allow fusion at a much higher density of operation than a standard tokamak, and our electromagnetic materials are potentially shrinking our reactor size down from a large warehouse to a garage.
Well, I mean, we could do that now with our cutting-edge nuclear tech, though. I mean, could we not? I mean, you wouldn't be having the same kind of power density, but I mean, you could power a neighborhood off of a garden shed.
Not necessarily a neighborhood off a garden shed,
a subdivision.
but we can. The only problem is you do have a lot more radiation coming out of those reactions, so you need to build it with shielding and all this other crazy stuff. As a matter of fact,
would you mind comparing and contrasting the kind of radiation and the levels that you would see differently in a fission versus fusion situation? Because I kind of get it, but I don't know if I necessarily do, and I imagine that anybody listening would actually be kind of curious.
So I had a debate with my father-in-law over Christmas, who he decided to come to me as a nuclear engineer and inform me how nuclear weapons worked. And he was wrong. It didn't end well. But the short version is what you get is you get a shift in the energy spectra. So a traditional fission device produces a significant amount of energy as thermal energy. But you also get all of these excess nuclides which go everywhere and a whole bunch of neutrons. If we shift into the fission spectrum or into the fusion spectrum, we get much more energy per unit of fusion, right? We get, if you actually, I'll try to link.
And I should actually stop for just a quick second and say radiation is legitimately a badly used word because, I mean, the light that is invariably shining on you from the monitor you might be watching this from is radiating at you. I mean, that's a radiation.
That's correct.
Too. So what I mean to say is like your alpha radiation, your gamma radiation, your X-rays, the things that are going to do damage to you. But radiation's kind of a catch-all term when it really maybe shouldn't be, and is probably part of the whole reason why nuclear power is kind of poo-pooed on, because radiation in and of itself has got this evil miasma, if you like.
So to talk to that point, right, we generally regard 4 different types of radiation. One is alpha, and this is basically a helium nucleus, right? It's got a charge of +2. It's ejected from the core of a nucleus of higher I can't remember the term right now.
More energetic?
Basically, it's got a whole crap load of protons in it.
Okay.
So the things that are really large, the really high mass isotopes, the high mass elements, they tend to emit alpha particles because the most stable element is iron, right? That's got the highest binding energy. Everything is really like the highest binding energy per nucleon. You don't really get anything out of iron. So anything above iron produces energy, and anything below iron produces energy as a result of nuclear reactions. The higher end spectra is going to be your uranium, your thorium, your uranium. Any of you who have smoke detectors, it's americium. And these produce alpha particles. And alpha particles, like I said, are just a helium nucleus. It's a +2 positive charge, and they're very safe in a relative sense. So if you needed to shield yourself from a significant alpha source, You just put up a piece of paper. In fact, you don't even need to do that. You could lay down on top of a piece of uranium cake-ish. This is exaggerated because there's technically some gamma that comes off uranium, but plutonium. You could lay yourself on top of plutonium, and you will not get significant radiation burns from that. And that is because your skin, the epidermis, will actually shield you from that. The dead layer of skin will shield you from the alpha particles. They've got a very short range. They don't have a ton of kinetic energy. They don't go very fast. They don't collide. They collide almost instantly with whatever they have. They charge up and they're done. So you might get some flaking of your dead skin, but it's not going to be like a crisis moment here. The problem that you have with alpha particles is ingestion. Like, if you were ever to go clean up uranium fuel pellets, you don't want to lick your hands afterwards. That would be bad. When we start talking about stories like the uranium boy, or the nuclear Boy Scout, or the kid who harvested a whole bunch of, smoke detectors or whatever, he basically harvested a bunch of americium-241, which is a very, very heavy isotope. And that's a huge alpha emitter. If you lick that or get that in you, it'll deposit into very specific areas of your body, and it'll release alpha particles into your healthy tissues, which is what does damage. But the external stuff does not.
And it will do that for its half-life, and then it will do half as much for its half-life, and then it will do half as much of that for its half-life. So
right. So basically,
you're fucked.
Not.
I mean,
depends on
not
how much
necessarily.
you get.
I mean, it might be a little amount, but I mean, you're going to now have a constant radiation, dangerous radiation source in you.
To give you an idea, one of the things that we most rigidly control is plutonium-238, or 230. I think it's 238, which is U-238 absorbs a neutron, emits a neutron somewhere in there. The neutron converts to a proton, something in that line. Or there's electron capture. I can't remember the exact, I believe it's 238 or 239 for plutonium. It's got almost no gamma emissions, but it's basically a straight alpha emitter. That thing will go straight to your marrow, and you'll get leukemia. That's how you get screwed, right? So you really don't want to absorb any of this contamination. The second type of radiation is known as beta. I rank these in terms of penetrating power. This is predominantly how we discuss things in the nuclear community. Beta is a little bit more different, a little bit more dangerous. It is basically a single electron, so it's only got one single positive charge to it. It's much lighter, they're emitted much faster, and so they penetrate deeper into your tissues. But, again, if you were to sit there and deal with a very strong beta source, it's not going to do much damage to you because most of those are still being absorbed by that outer layer of dead skin. You will get radiation burns on it because it will penetrate the epidermis and hit your dermis, but it's not really a crisis. Where we end up reinforcing people when they're dealing with strong beta sources is we'll put a piece of basically plastic shielding, which is literally nothing more than like, you've seen the people with the plastic, like, face covers. That's what we do. We do the same thing for...
We're not even talking, like, window thickness, Lexan, just, sheeting, basically.
Yes, and that's put in front of their eyes, and that they have been shielded from beta. When we wear our TLDs, they've got a very thin plastic shield that goes over one section, and that tells us the amount of beta that we've absorbed into our thermoluminescent dosimeters. Now, the two remaining things are really when we start talking about radiation, where a nuclear engineer sits there and starts talking about radiation, because the other two are so easily stopped. As long as you aren't licking your fingers after you're handling fuel, you're pretty much good, kind of thing. And those are neutron and gamma. And neutron radiation is literally a neutron. They tend to be traveling very quickly, but they don't really hit very much because it's a neutral particle, right? So it just kind of passes through the atom. If it happens to hit the core of your nucleus, you'll get a reaction, maybe. If it happens to pass through the nuclear field and it's strong enough, you might get a reaction, and that's how you get your dose from these nuclides. They'll either hit the nucleus and excite them, and so they start releasing additional photons, or it'll get captured and kind of change the isotope configuration of the atoms in the molecules that they hit, or alternatively, that's basically it. So that the neutrons are generally considered more damaging because that's like your alchemist's transmutation. It is literally changing the fundamental fabric of who and what you are.
Yeah, this is where kind of your mutations from radiation kind of trope comes from, you could say. It's not really accurate. It is, yes. But it's like, it's not in the way they mean. It's like, yeah, it does change things on a fundamental level, but your body isn't you're not gonna turn, well, you get enough, you might turn into an ooze, but you're not gonna be an ooze that walks and thinks. You're just going to ooze.
Right. And the last form, and so these are neutral, indirectly ionizing radiation. It ionizes you from the after effects of actually it colliding with you. And by the way, most neutrons will pass through you. If you're standing in a large neutron field, in order to we measure things in terms of dose field, the actual flux of neutrons that pass through you is significantly larger for something like that than some other fields. Like low energy gamma fields probably have a lower number of photons that are hitting you than number of neutrons in high energy physics, because most of them just zip on by. Doesn't even faze you. No big deal, right? Where neutrons actually, and I guess we'll get into that for your core question, which is how does this shift the nuclear reaction? The fourth type of radiation, for clarification, is gamma. And these are literally
alpha,
photons.
Beta, what's the third?
Neutron.
Oh, neutron radiation.
Neutron radiation. And then the last one is gamma. Now, there's technically modifications to each of these things, but for high-level stuff, it's alpha has no penetrating power, beta has a little bit of penetrating power, neutrons go right through you, and gamma goes right through you. Now, gamma is basically the next level of energy of a light particle above an X-ray, right? And they predominantly, the majority of your interactions there are going to be scatter, right? They're basically going to collide with an electron and eject that electron. And that is where you get most of your damage, right? We're really concerned about gamma. Neutron is kind of scary. Gamma is somewhat scary, predominantly because if I hit you with a whole bunch of gamma, it's bouncing a whole bunch of electrons up, which is destabilizing your entire chemical structure. Right? So that's how gamma works. Again, most of this stuff doesn't even hit you. And the higher the energy, the less of it actually hits you. But the more damage it does, if it does, right?
Well, yeah, it's like it's a shotgun blast, but, it's very, very tiny pellets and moving very fast. So,
right.
It's going to go where it's going to go, and it's going to do a lot of damage. But if it misses, it completely misses.
That's correct, and most of them miss, especially as you increase in overall energy of particles, they generally miss. So when we start talking about what's the difference in your nuclear reactions, it's not as much for your fission types, fission versus fusion in terms of like what we would normally call this stuff. A fission reaction produces, if I hit a U-235 atom with a neutron, it splits into, so that would become uranium-236 for an incredibly short period of time. And that'll split into two new atoms, which are approximately half the size of the 236. So, quick math, that's roughly 118, right?
Okay.
So it'll be some arrangement of protons and neutrons. Each one's going to be roughly about 118. A lot of this comes out to be cesium, cesium-137, I think it is. I think it's 137. I'm trying to do all of this off the top of my head, which is really, really hard.
Oh, yeah, no problem.
But a large portion of this is cesium-137, which is a little bit higher, or at least that's our controlled mixture nuclide, right? It's got a really great beta signature, so we basically say the proportion that we'd get of mixed fission products is going to have this much cesium. Cesium kicks around for this period of time, therefore we can sit there and control your actual exposure based on the cesium nuclides, right? But it's going to be roughly about 118 in its two splits, with sometimes that split will be a little bit higher on one versus the other. But either way, that's what ends up happening. So you get a mixture of alpha particles, you get a mixture of neutrons, you get a mixture of all this other stuff in a fission reaction. So it's got a whole bunch of excess left over. A fusion reaction, by contrast, doesn't have any alpha particles. It doesn't really have any beta particles. You're combining two nuclides into one, so technically you're getting a little bit less waste than you normally would, but you tend to have a few spare neutrons left over in the reaction because you're going to be combining things like it's not really stable to stick two protons together. So typically what they'll do is they'll do like two deuterium atoms, which will form a helium, and you'll still get some proportion of neutrons as a result of that. But most of that energy is going to be given off in gamma radiation, and the energy of that spectra is much, much higher. So, going back to the debate that I had with my father-in-law over Christmas, he believed that there was a bomb that we could create that would do nothing but irradiate cities and just kill everybody from the radiation. That doesn't happen.
Well,
we
I
can't
guess
do
you
that.
could. Any problem can be engineered, right?
I suppose.
But gosh, you'd have to use so much electricity to actually do something like that. You'd have to have like a power plant.
It certainly wouldn't be a bomb. It wouldn't be a bomb at that point. It would be something entirely different. It would be a doomsday device. It'd be something roughly akin to a neutron laser, right? So it'd be like Death Star, but you're kind of a dick.
Okay, fair enough.
Right?
Yeah.
So we don't really have the ability to do that. So what he was talking about is a real device. They're called neutron bombs. And this is like, I was trying to tell him he was wrong while simultaneously trying to explain where this comes from. And the neutron bomb is a real device which gets slightly less atmospheric yield because we're not producing as many atoms. Most of the energy is going to be going off as photons and neutrons, because that's what happens in those kinds of explosions. So you basically get a 10% reduction in overall blast yield, while significantly, shifting the spectra to more neutrons and photons. And that's what ends up happening with fusion. Now, one of the cool parts about fusion is if I turn around and I did something like this, right? Again, we talked about how we have neutrons and photons, which are gamma and neutron radiation, which is kind of scary. The cool part about a fusion reaction, as opposed to a fission reaction, is I can drop a fusion reaction into a pot of water, right? It's going to boil that pot of water. I'm going to get my steam. I'm going to have a beautiful, beautiful, standard, easy to work with plant. And then those neutrons, when a neutron collides with a hydrogen atom, right, which water has two of them, it immediately reduces it, drops it right out of whatever spectral mode it's in, because imagine if I fired you at another version of you. If I hit you with another you, you get half as much energy afterwards, right? And the same kind of thing happens when I fire a whole bunch of neutrons through a hydrogenous media. So if I have a fusion reactor, I can shield it really easily, because the same thing that I would be using to generate my steam is going to be the same thing that's going to be my shielding, and it's going to be my fuel source. And that is what makes fusion super cool.
Oh, okay.
The fact that it gets 4 times as much energy per unit.
It really is. Nature of the way that it works.
And for every atom that I fuse together, as opposed to fizz, right? For every atom I fuse together, I get 4 times as much energy out of. And these atoms are significantly more abundant, and they weigh significantly less. So we could, theoretically, and I say this as and this is not derisive, but the whole principle behind the concepts of like cold fusion and leaner or low energy nuclear reactions is this hope that we could find a way to generate fusion levels of energy in a very, very tiny space that doesn't require plasma confinement and would allow us to basically do all of that futuristic crap that you see in sci-fi movies. So, you want your fusion pulse rifle? That's because it's got something that's roughly the equivalent of a battery in terms of size, but is outputting significantly more wattage than what your entire household will consume in a year.
So, since we're on the topic, what is cold fusion?
A myth and a legend.
Okay.
So cold fusion, it's really tough to talk about cold fusion with a straight face.
What would be a thing that actually functions in the fashion of cold fusion? As depicted.
Again, so we have to go into if we're going to go into cold fusion, we have to talk about why we think it exists.
Okay.
Right? So back in the day, I'm not sure when these experiments were originally done, they set up something that was roughly equivalent to a battery, right? It was a metal plate in a solution, and then they took a voltage at the top. And this was the original cold fusion experiment. And what they found at the top was significantly more energy, or a significantly higher voltage out of this thing, than what they were originally expecting. Basically, we calculated for what a battery can do, and we got like 10 times what we were supposed to. So the only feasible way they could get that much of an energy increase is if a non-chemical reaction was occurring. Right?
Okay.
That is what cold fusion is. They reported these results. It was absolutely astounding. The U.S. government came in. Everybody came in, because if they were correct, they could basically make batteries that were 10 times as powerful as they were by accident, right? So if we could refine that process, we could probably get energy weapons, right?
Sure.
So everybody's interested in this stuff at this time. Problem is, it failed replication. And it failed replication again. So the last time that they did the experiment, they prepared, I think it was like 100 different vials in the original methodology, or some ridiculous number of them. 1/3 of the vials that were tested showed an anomalous energy result. 1/3 of the vials showed less than expected energy, and 1/3 showed no significant change. The conclusion of the scientists that were overseeing the work was that one of the 3 scientists said, yep, it's real. One of the 3 scientists said, no, it's not real. And one of the 3 scientists said, maybe it's real. So the full result was that cold fusion became kind of a naughty word in science. Nobody wanted to pursue cold fusion research. So they rebranded it as LENR, or low energy nuclear reactions. Okay. And what they're kind of going for is this holy grail of essentially room temperature nuclear reactions.
Well, fair. I mean, for the longest time it was thought that you couldn't do a room temperature superconductor. So, I mean, it might be feasible. It's worth looking into.
It's worth looking into.
I mean, as you say, material science has gotten us to the edge of actual fusion just by getting better.
Yep.
So,
and
we might need that right metamaterial to make it work.
If they found it, that would be amazing. The only problem is that they find it repeatedly, and it never really materializes. So there's a couple odd patents out there that really make people kind of suspicious until you realize the government patents everything that might possibly happen. So one of those was known as the E-catalyzer. I don't know if you remember any of this, but I believe the guy's name was Rossi. In any case, this Italian guy, who's kind of a known con artist, said that he produced a reaction from nickel and hydrogen, and he wasn't really specific as to how it works. He wouldn't tell anybody exactly how it works, but basically what he did when they sat there and they ran the test is they pulled copper out of it at the end, and that's kind of what the expected result was. The only problem is the nuclear physicist stepped in and said, yeah, but that doesn't really work with our understanding of the energy curve of these isotopes, so we're kind of skeptical. So he allowed people to do all kinds of tests. The only problem is that none of them were, like, he produced the result that he was looking for, but there were ways that they could. He put so many restrictions on the experiment and the testing criteria that at the end of the day, nobody could really validate how that he was doing what he was saying he was doing, because he was producing all this excess energy. And while they were allowed to measure voltage going into the unit at a certain point and at another point, the way that you can actually build circuits that will circumvent the voltage detectors they were allowed to use. So that was one cold fusion device that very likely went nowhere. A second one was a patent that was filed by NASA, I think circa 2013, 2014, and every conspiracy theorist in the world jumped on it. The short of it was they were running an experiment where they had a nickel lattice, or I think it was nickel. Don't quote me on that.
Actually,
they had a nickel lattice, a super pure crystal of this stuff. Then they had a whole bunch of a carrier solution of hydrogen. They either fed the hydrogen in, or it was water, and they vibrated it somewhere around 60 terahertz, which is ridiculously fast. Like your average human vibrator, a lot less than that. Significantly less than that. Your fingers do not move at 60 terahertz, ladies. I assure you.
Not even the electronic ones.
Not even the electronic one. So that produced, basically what ended up happening was there was a lab explosion on this experiment. NASA filed a patent, and nobody knows what happened thereafter. So, maybe they discovered cold fusion with a 60 terahertz oscillator, or maybe it was nothing. Nobody knows.
Well, either way, they did find something that released a lot of energy.
Yeah, but there's
all
those
sorts
kinds
of ways
of projects get those disappear. If it was legitimate, it would have disappeared, and we would never know anything more than that patent getting filed. And if it was illegitimate, it would have disappeared, and we would have known nothing more than that patent getting filed. So it could be real, it might not be real. Most people, again, 60 terahertz is hard to come by. So most people aren't going to have the equipment that is able to do that experiment again. And, yeah. There was enough specificity in the patent that anybody who wanted to could have probably replicated the work, and the fact that nobody has means that either there's a whole bunch of really great CIA agents out there, congratulations boys, or it was bullshit and nobody ever was able to pull it off. But that's why fusion is the holy grail, because it shifts the energy spectrum into something that's very easy to manage with like no waste and nothing but profitable byproducts. And, oh yeah, we get 4 times as much energy per nuclide as we do with fission. And when we start talking about on a mass basis, it's absolutely amazing stuff. Like, absolutely amazing. Small amounts of hydrogen, or small amounts of deuterium, carried into space on a fusion-powered rocket would comfortably fuel the spaceship for just about ever. And, by the way, because the cosmic rays in space is a very dangerous place, radiation-wise. So the amount of dose that I'm allowed to receive is about 5,000 millirem per year. And that is that I'm not allowed to receive that. That the federal limit is 5,000 millirem per year. I'm not allowed to receive more than 100 millirem. I think I'm at 1 for like the last 4 to 6 years of my entire experience with nuclear reactors. I might have a millirem of lifetime dose at this point.
That's what, less than normal flights, right?
It's significantly. So your average background is somewhere between 2 to 3 millirem per hour. Flight gets you into the 4 to 5 millirem range, I think. That's what it is. There's a great, for anybody who's interested, there's a great documentary that really went through radiation and nuclear concerns, called Pandora's Box. It is a fantastic documentary. It actually walks you through the average dose rates that you would get from hiking in the White Mountains, which I think was like 3 millirem per hour when I got up to the top of a mountain. And I was actually on the mountain that they filmed it on, because I like hiking in New Hampshire. The outside of the Chernobyl shell was something like 3 millirem per hour. outside of the coffin, as they call it, for the reactor. And it's pretty astounding. But yeah, I think my lifetime excess dose is something like 1 to 2 millirem per hour. I spent, and granted I'm an engineer, I don't really have a reason to be playing around with nuclear components unless I absolutely have to. But at the same time, I've also pulled fluids from a nuclear reactor to do gamma spec on them. And I think my exposure during that 2-day period, or 3 day, or what was it, 2 weeks, was 0.17 millirem total absorbed dose. So you don't get very much from nuclear. Our current designs are so very good in our nuclear reactors that you just don't get a lot of dose unless you're actively trying to get a lot of dose. But when we start talking about fusion, you'd have negligible dose.
Yeah, it would be to say that there is less dose there to even get.
Yes. You'd be generating your own fuel as you go from the base stuff that we need anyways. And it would be like, it'd basically be almost self-sustaining. We could easily build a fusion-powered rocket, and as long as we go to the moon's filled with deuterium, which is largely there from ice deposits, right? But because in space you're bombarded by radiation. Again, I was going back through my stuff. I get 5 rem per year, or 5,000 millirem per year is my allowable dose by federal regulation. If you are an astronaut, your allowable dose per year is 25 rem per year. It's 25,000 millirem per year, and that's because when you're in space, you are exposed to nothing but radiation. And the great part is that means there's a whole bunch of these activated nuclides on Mars and on the moon and all of these other places that we're looking to go. So there's plenty of fuel out there.
So more to that point then, what about shielding?
So again, shielding's as simple as water, right? When you start talking about this, the major problem that you're going to have. So there's 2 things that we use, right? So if you're going for gamma shielding, gamma interacts with electrons. So what you want is an electron dense material that'll be your high proton elements. So we tend to use things like lead for shielding or steel for shielding, right? When we're dealing with neutrons, the primary thing that we're using is hydrogenous material, because that's what slows them down the best. And so that'll be things like water, and it's pretty much always water, because that's how it works, right? So when we sit there and we start calculating the
metal-skinned, water-filled blimps.
Pretty much.
In space.
You could do something like that, but I mean, realistically, you could turn around, you could build a rocket that had a fusion reactor in the back, and if you stick the water plant, all of the water plant machinery, all those piping materials in the core of the rocket, and you have the back of the reactor at the back of the ship, and all the other generating equipment in between you and that ship, that's going to provide enough shielding that you'll be happily able to pilot that ship with minimal concerns. Like all of these, I know they do these space dramas where you get a radiation leak, and that's not how that works.
Well, if you think back to the first Fast and the Furious movies, the very first one even, to a person that's like a car person, they're very cringy and very bad because everything's absolutely terrible and a horrible representation of how things are. But you look at pretty much any given car movie now, and they're pretty accurate with their terminology and their understanding of how cars work. You know, it's as it goes with entertainment, it kind of goes with science too. You know, the more we know, the more we know.
I mean, I'd agree with you, but then I also sit there and look at things like Die Hard, which had magic guns that can clean up pooled radiation, and Die Hard 4 that was.
I must have missed that. I definitely missed that one. That sounds like an amazing scene.
It was very amazing. They were going into the Chernobyl reactor, which looked like it was a friggin' ghost town, but Chernobyl just shut down in 2006, which was it was actually not too far before the movie was made, right? But they're going into the Chernobyl reactor to go get nuclear material for whatever purposes, and they're like, oh my god, we gotta clean up this pooled radiation, and I was like, I don't know if I'm gonna make it.
Pooled radiation?
Pooled radiation, yes. So for those who are listening, who are like, what's wrong with that?
Oh.
Radiation radiates. It does not pool. That is a contradiction in physics.
So, yeah, I actually get that. So, if they were to do it right, maybe a pool of radioactive waste? But
nope.
Oh, wow.
They walked into a room with magic guns that cleaned up the pooled radiation so they could handle the nuclear material.
So they, well, actually, no, it makes perfect sense. They shot all the protons, electrons, and neutrons that were coming at them.
That's exactly right.
They were lead bullets. So there you go. They were just shooting them very fast.
It was a very, very impressive equipment.
They were just very accurate with their shots. They happened to, line them up perfectly for those electrons.
Let me see if I can actually. I gotta find a.
Oh, that's really horrible, man. Wow, that's. Oh, Hollywood.
It was. Yeah, it's really bad. I feel. I don't know. Maybe it was 4 or 5. Was 4 one of the original ones? It was whatever that new one was.
I haven't seen it. Oh, was it? Oh, was that the one that was a PG?
It might have been.
Oh, okay.
It might have been.
Yeah, I specifically didn't see it because that movie is supposed to be rated R.
It was not the it was the modern version of it.
Oh,
whatever
okay.
that
So
was.
of course, it had to be horrible then. Of course, that
yeah,
makes perfect
it
sense.
was. It was pretty bad, but this is one of the things that is very cringy from nuclear physics perspective is always how Hollywood handles these things. And it seems like I don't get me wrong, I hate to be that guy in the theater, right? And I've been that guy in the theater when Aliens vs. Predator 2 came out, right? I was that guy in the theater. I actually walked up and was like, I want my money back. I was not entertained. I can't take it, right? Star Wars, the not the most recent new series, but episodes 1, 2, and 3 when they're fighting in space, and the spaceship starts tumbling, and they lose their grav plating, and then they start tumbling in the spaceship instead of in free fall, right? All of these things do irritate me ever so slightly, but man, let me tell you, I lose it all when it comes to radiation because you get some fantastic scenes like the most recent Chernobyl movie where they walk up to the woman who's like, so all of the workers had been deconned, right? They're showing them, and they actually did a very good progression of radiation sickness where you got all these burns, and then there's this period where you're okay, and then all of your systems turn to shit and you look like something out of the X-Files. That's a fairly good progression. But then they turn around and they had the nurse walk up to her, as she's just lost her child, they're like, the child protected you from the radiation of your husband. You're like, no. If pregnant women were useful as shielding, we might actually consider using them as shielding.
As grim as that is, I wouldn't be surprised.
I mean, Planned Parenthood gets a whole bunch of people that we could just stack around a nuclear reactor.
I mean, they were selling body parts for Lambos, so who knows?
Right.
Speaking of parts, you linked me up something that happened over the last week. The flight over, I think it was out of Denver on its way to Hawaii. So, for anyone that missed that, I'll have a link to the OSINT technical here that you sent to me so that they can check out actual video of it. But there was a large boom in the sky, and there's some video of it from the ground. And basically this was a 777?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the engine exploded, basically. You're going to be able to explain it a lot better than I can, but I'll link it up here for anybody that wants to see that.
They call it an uncontained failure because parts fell off the plane. Right. Not sure what the actual cause was. I found a couple articles that said that 777s, there's been a couple other incidents in this past year or whatever where they have similar issues with the engines. So the FAA is a pretty reliable investigatory organization. They really do dig into these things, and they will ground planes and manufacturers. They do not sit there and cave. I do not have an issue. When the FAA comes out and says this is safe or this is not safe, I really don't have an issue with them. Unlike, vaccine manufacturers, right? But when the FAA does stuff, they do a thorough investigation.
Actually, just on that, the FAA has put out an emergency directive. This, as of recording, was about 6 hours ago, so about 7 p.m. Eastern Time. There is a... I'll just read it. After consulting with teams of aviation safety experts about yesterday's engine failure aboard a 777 in Denver. Oh, okay. The FAA is working closely with civil aviation authorities to make the information available to effective operators in their jurisdictions. Basically, everything's going to be requiring stepped up and immediate inspections for all 777s. So this might be some kind of systemic issue.
Well, so like I said, they found 3 or 4 different planes over the last year that have had that issue. So the 777 has been in operation since the early 1990s, and this plane is no different. Obviously, they can upgrade the interiors, but they're all using kind of the same engine, the same components. The way the airline industry is regulated, it's extremely heavily regulated, very similar to the nuclear industry. And they basically they get approval to do something, and that's it. That's all they'll do forever and a day. You might get a new paint job, you might do these planes, but they sit there forever. So, and part of the reason is that it's so expensive to launch a new plane that every single time they do, it's got to pass extensive safety testing. But there have been 3 or 4 incidences in the last year with that specific engine. The W400 4000 series that has raised some eyebrows. So we'll see how this all plays out. My guess is it's not going to be a 747 Supermax or 737 Supermax or whatever the fuck it was.
That's actually a perfect example of that. Even with all the issues that they've had, they've gone to great lengths to remedy those as opposed to building something new.
Yeah, and that's kind of the thing is, for the most part, the 737 Supermax was actually not a bad plane. They just didn't. So the problem that you have, right, when you start talking about something like the Boeing 737, is that plane is so large and so massive that it can stall out. It is literally pushing the limits of what we can safely do with aircraft in our atmosphere with current jet engine technology. It's brilliant. It's brilliant to push these things that far. It really is. And they had the core problem is that they had a software system. They knew this was an issue. So they had a software system that would actually mitigate the problem entirely.
Yeah, what is it? The thing with it, the nose dips on its own.
Yes.
And has to be corrected for.
So it calculates, it says, oh shit, we're having too much jet wash from our own engines. And so it dips the nose a little bit so your climb isn't quite as high, and therefore it's not a problem, right? And so it's literally a software upgrade that they figured out was kind of a problem, and they decided to make that an upgrade feature rather than a mandatory feature on the planes. So realistically, Boeing took a hit, and they should have taken a hit, and I was kind of mad that they got a bailout because they made a bad choice, right? You should never make critical safety features optional. You should never do that. I'm okay if you want to make, your comfy leather seats optional. I am not okay with you turning around and saying this thing makes the plane fall out of the air. That's no bueno in Steve's book, right? So that's basically what it was. It was a software thing. It was an automatic thing that kicked in and overrode the pilot's authorization or the pilot's choice. and corrected the flight midair, and therefore it would alleviate all the problems. But they would much rather do that than redo the 737 certification, because the 737 is, it's able to get just ridiculous fuel economy in that plane. But the 777s have been around since the 90s, and their jet engines have been around since the 90s.
Oh, actually,
and my
I'll
guess
include
is
a link to the Windover Productions video on the 737. They did a really, really good one that breaks down why it was made the way it was made and what really happened with that.
Yep. It really, the 737 is a beautiful piece of technology. It really is. Granted, scary technology. I'm sure I'd be super comfortable flying on one until they got a few dozen test flights in. But, when we start talking about this, most likely the reason the FAA is sitting there and starting to talk about communicating these things is because we've seen a whole bunch of engines of that type in this year sit there and go down. And when that kind of thing happens, there's two possibilities: is a routine maintenance replacement part was not up to standards and failed, right? And that's what's causing all of these problems. And it failed the same way, and it failed the same way in all the engines at all the time, and so that's going to get swapped out. Or it could be that these engines are literally nearing the end of their service life, and they'll need to swap out the engines on these planes. But you gotta hold it, hang your hat up that this plane had an engine, one of its two engines, physically exploded midair, and they were still able to land safely with no major issues. And that is a beautiful aspect of engineering.
Oh, and was burning like a furnace when you
it was burning.
Yeah.
It was actually on fire.
I mean, congratulations on redundant systems. I mean, the thing's built like a tank, if you will.
Well, and that's the thing, is that aircraft are very safe. They really are very, very safe pieces of equipment. I've had my experience. So my wife came from a lower class family than I did, so I was used to growing up and flying. And it's okay, so I've got to go sit down and do something for 6 hours while I wait for this thing to land. No big deal. But for her, she was fascinated the first time we started taking plane flights together, right? So she's looking out the window, and all of a sudden she wakes me up, my wonderful engineering brain, and she's like, "Look at that! There's shit out there boiling on the airplane." I went, "Ah." She's like, "Is that normal?" I'm like, "No."
Oh.
So most likely it was hydraulic fluid. I did some quick calculations based on the altitude that we were at and the temperature that was likely outside. It was probably at the boiling point for the hydraulic fluid, which is very, very lightweight mechanical oil. And basically, that's what it's geared for. So most likely a line had blown, and so the flaps were there. But man, let me tell you, those stewardesses, they come over, they're like, "You don't need to sit there and talk about this, sir." You're like, well, I mean, you blew a line. Like,
yeah, that'll throw you for a little bit of a loop.
And you're like, okay, I get it. And they're like, "We are going to be able to land safely." I'm sure you are.
I hope so. But again,
sure
those systems they're built really tough, and they are built with redundancies in mind. Like, any one of those systems can be manually operated.
Yeah, I mean, all of the hydraulics in all the world, it's the same thing as your car. When your hydraulic steering cuts out, it really sucks to fucking drive that thing, but you can still fucking drive that thing.
Yeah, you can just manhandle it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how these things are kind of built. And that's to a point.
Yep.
Now, there was something else you were wanting to mention, Comrade Commissar Cuomo?
Yes. We, unfortunately, due to last week, and I blame this all on you, Evan, it's all your fault. I'm just very happy that everybody is aware and paying attention to Androlf Cuomo and how many people he murdered with his order to bury people in the nursing homes. And I don't know, man. I go back and forth on this all the time. I really do. because I understand why he made that order. My mother-in-law, she works for a nursing home, and you do need to, basically the hospitals are full. They need to discharge a patient. Where do you send them? How do you handle that, right? Like, you can't send somebody in a nursing home into a random spot. The only problem is that in this case, and this is where Cuomo deserves some scrutiny here, Trump sent a hospital ship.
Yeah, I was
to
going to
New
mention
York.
that. There was one of the. Now, didn't they also convert the Javits Center as well?
They did convert the Javits Center, and on top of that, there was also a religious group that set up a field hospital in the park. So there was literally like 3 alternative places that were set up, and they chose not to send patients there for political reasons. They didn't want to send patients to the hospital ship because it would benefit Trump. They didn't want to send patients to the field hospital set up by the religious organization because that would be non-kosher with liberal Manhattan. And so as such, they sent a whole bunch of people who were already sick, and, I mean, granted, they were on the mend, like they were released from the hospital, they weren't a crisis unit, but they sent a whole bunch of people who could still shed the virus into nursing homes and basically killed something like 15,000 people.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, aren't like more than a third of the U.S. deaths based in New York?
A lot of them are. If you actually, so this is one of the things that I have been playing with the numbers for my own purposes, right? But if you actually start talking about New York and all of its things, it is. I think New Jersey actually beat us. New Jersey has a higher overall death toll per capita than New York does. But at the same time, New York is the second highest deaths per capita in the United States. Or at least it was the last time I checked. And if you're starting to talk about this for a moment, right, it was when this whole thing was going on about how they were going to accuse Trump of having killed 100,000 people or 200,000 people or whatever it was that they were accusing Trump of at the time, a solid 30,000 people in that period of time were dead in New York, and 15,000 of that 30,000 were directly tied to Ed Rolf Kuhlner's orders.
Yeah, his specific decision to release these people back into these nursing homes as opposed to, any of the available resources that had been available to him by any number of different organizations or even the damn city hospital at the Javits Center.
Yep. And so Cuomo chose to kill people instead of sitting there and allowing Trump to take any credit for assisting him in any way, shape, or form. And this extended into the respirators argument because he had something like a couple thousand respirators that Trump had sent him that he said never arrived until they pointed out exactly where they were, and then they're like, well, whatever. But I mean, this is a very sad thing, right? And when we start talking about we've talked a lot on this show about the deaths from COVID, and I come in as a COVID skeptic as opposed to Evan and Craig in both cases. But a large portion of that is how much of it is really a problem. Now, we had a huge wave that burned through in February and March, well, particularly March and April and May. And a large portion of that is due to people like my governor standing up and sending people into nursing homes. And this was an order that was carried out in New York. This was an order that was carried out in Massachusetts, in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and a variety of other blue states. They sent the people who were already sick into the places with the most vulnerable. And I really do hope that the people of New York, if any of you are listening, that you actually hold him to account for this. I think that if you happen to be in a state where your governor actually did the same thing, again, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, all of them did this. And I understand that they had to have a place to go, but at least in New York, there were places to go and they weren't there. And what makes this really horrendous is not necessarily the fact that a bad decision was made. I think I've had this discussion with Craig. I don't have an issue with something like Benghazi, right? Clinton made a bad decision when it comes to Benghazi, right? Cuomo made a bad decision when it comes to these nursing homes. But at the same time, leaders will make bad decisions, and they'll make bad decisions for bad reasons. And that doesn't mean that they're bad people.
I mean, but that doesn't specifically mean that they are.
Right, that doesn't mean
they are bad people, just to be clear. But yeah, please continue.
At the end of the day, you can make a decision based on the information that you have at the time, and you can hope for the best, anticipate the worst, and in this case, Cuomo had alternatives. He had the Javits Center. He had the Mercy Hospital ship, right? He had those two alternatives, and he chose not to take advantage of them. But what makes this situation especially egregious is he decided to hide the numbers because he didn't want to get called out publicly during an election year by the Trump campaign for the fact that he had basically murdered 15,000 New Yorkers.
Not only
a problem.
Not even just 15,000 New Yorkers. 15,000 at-risk New Yorkers.
Right.
And in doing so, further exacerbated the problem of said pandemic. Because if those people had been adequately taken care of, that's how many less vectors of infection.
Well, it's not just that. You figure that assuming, let's say that the order had not been carried out in New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania, how many fewer deaths would we have had? Right? And when they are trying to sell the pandemic and the responses like masks and the responses like lockdowns and all of these other power grabs that are coming in from the various states, if they didn't have those body counts from the nursing homes and the actual orders to put people in the nursing homes who were sick, if we didn't have those numbers, we probably would never have entered this crisis phase that we're trying to deal with now and we can't pull out of. So Cuomo did a lot of bad things, and I understand why he did them, but the sad part is that he chose to cover it up instead of facing the music. Instead of facing one bad news cycle for a poor decision as a governor, which I could forgive him for. I really could, and I know there's a lot of people who are going to be mad at me for that. But I can forgive an individual for making a bad call, because it is a call and it's a bad call for a variety of different reasons.
But I mean, at least if you can own up to your problems, you can work on fixing them.
Right, exactly. Like, you could turn around and you could say, hey, I thought I was trying to solve this problem by doing this thing, and it was the wrong decision. And if you did that, I'd be okay with it. But he chose to hide it, and he chose to hide it so he didn't get called out, and instead, he got his friggin' Emmy. He sat there and nuked the election cycle, and that's really what it comes down to. It looks like it was him hiding his death rates because A, he wanted to keep his powers, B, he didn't want Trump to win election, and C, he didn't want to face the consequences of his poor decision. And that's a problem to me.
Well, that's completely reasonable. And, I mean, anybody that's not a complete sycophant should probably agree on at least a basic level.
I mean, apparently there are Democrats that are pushing for his revocation of his powers.
Well, I'll say this. Good on you for doing something, but they need to find a way to get him out of all powers. That man should be kept away from politics forever. For what could be argued as his crimes against the people of New York.
I mean, frankly, in terms of Cuomo and that one executive order, again, like I said, I'm not...
And this is also never minding any of the stuff with locking down the Jews. Literally locking down the Jews.
That was more de Blasio, though, right? So the problem that you have is that you gotta sort between the two, de Blasio and Cuomo.
Oh, that's a fair
This
point.
case, in this case, with the people that died
no, you're right.
as
That
a result
actually
of
wasn't
Cuomo's orders.
specifically that is a de Blasio thing.
That is a de Blasio thing. So when we start talking about this again, it is one bad call. It is absolutely, in every single way, a bad call. But if you are a leader of the people, and I want to even go further, it was a bad call that you could determine was a bad call at the time the call was made. I understand that he was trying to solve a real problem, right? Which is that you have a whole bunch of people in hospitals that need a place to go, right? That is a problem that Cuomo was trying to solve. I also understand why he didn't want to take avail of the mercy ship. And if you think it's anything other than politics, you're way out of line. I get it. It's a bad call. He made a bad series of decisions, and he should have to live with that for the rest of his days. The problem is that he chose to cover it up. He chose to get his Emmy and not sit there and say anything. He chose to sit there and go through an entire election season where they blamed Trump for these 200,000 deaths when he knew outright that he was the cause for at least, 15,000 of them? I mean, that's insane. Cuomo was responsible for 15,000 of the nationwide deaths that they blamed Trump for. That's a problem.
Yeah, the blood is on his hands, and I mean,
it is.
There's so much there that it's kind of in the realms of you can never be clean of that much blood.
And I get him making the decision that he did. I do. Because at the same time, we can't turn around and be in a position where we're discharging people from the hospital because they need the beds and having them have no place to go. I totally get it.
Yeah, well, anyone would if there was no place to go.
If there was no place to go. He did have options. He chose not to take advantage of them for political reasons, and he should be crucified for that. But at the same time, the thing that really irks me is that he chose to hide it.
Well, not only that, too.
He got the praise and the adoration of the United States media, and he, at the whole entire time, the reason our numbers in this country were as bad as they were is largely because of him. And
Absolutely.
His botched failure.
And the thing is, he could have... That was a rolling problem that could have been resolved further on in. It could have been like, oh, shit, we really messed up.
Yep.
We sent these people here. Okay, tell you what we've got. We've got the Mercy Ship. We've got the Javits Center. All right, we're moving everybody from these centers into here until everybody's cleared.
Yep.
No such thing occurred. No ownership.
I mean, it's difficult. It's difficult after it's happened to sit there and deal with the damage that's done, right? That's a true thing. Because you take somebody who was infected with a disease and you dump them into a nursing home, which is the most vulnerable population, and we know that at the start, the damage is largely going to be done, right? There's a variety of things that should have been done, such as isolation of personnel to individual care centers, whereas in New York you have individuals who will travel between these nursing homes. They should have limited that spread and the whole bit. There's a lot of things they could have fixed. But at the same time, the damage was largely done with the initial order.
Kind of things. These are like what you would think would be standard operating
infection
procedure
protocols.
Or, infection protocols, exactly. You would think that these would be things put down in place from having the Ebola scares, from the swine flu. But nothing. They got absolutely nothing.
Yeah, I mean, and again, you can totally blame him for not taking advantage of the Mercy Ship. And you can totally blame him for not taking advantage of the Javits Center. That is 100% at the feet of Cuomo. There are bodies and blood on his hands. But at the same time, that's one of the downsides to being in a leadership position. I could excuse that and say, you know what? He made a bad call. It was a bad call that he should have known ahead of time. He factored all this stuff in, and he factored it in wrong. Totally get it. We all make mistakes. But, in this case, he chose to hide the data and specifically tried to put blame on other people for that data, all of which makes this inexcusable.
And continues to do so to this day.
Yes, he does. I mean, turning around and saying that the Justice Department was coming in asking about the data, and therefore they had to hide it, is not a very good excuse.
It's kind of a horrible excuse and a terrible, terrible look. I mean, I'll say this. A senator from Texas taking off to Cancun is not a good look. It's not. Now, mind you, this isn't the mayor of the city. This isn't the governor. This is just some senator. And, you know, that is a bad look when everybody's in a shitty situation.
Yep.
But then when you come back right away, and just like I had mentioned there, you know, you could have isolated those populations. You could have done any of the things. So, in this case, you come right back the next day. We didn't get that. And what kind of crucifixion is going towards Ted Cruz right now, as opposed to
well, and that's kind of the thing is what's Ted Cruz going to do, right?
Yeah,
like his role.
What can one senator do about an energy system that appears to be kind of fucked from the top down?
The best thing that he can do is turn around when he gets back. First off, the entirety of the Senate is off right now. So, ladies and gentlemen, the Democrats control the Senate, and you aren't getting your checks because everybody's got to have a vacation, right? Take your anger out wherever it may be. But Ted Cruz has nothing that he can do in this case with Texas. He's not able to change any of the laws. He's not able to change any of the resources. The actual orders associated with what's screwing the people in Texas are coming down from Joe Biden's administration directly.
Yeah,
right?
So even if he could call in favors, there's literally
even if he could call in
could
favors,
do.
There's literally, and I assure you that I am sure that he is doing the most that he can do on a cell phone, right? Like every single time I see that, oh my God, the president's on vacation, the president's going and playing golf, and whether it's Trump or Obama, I was like, yeah, and you're telling me that he doesn't have 30 fucking aides sitting there and answering calls for him? Bullshit. He gets a full update every hour on the hour as to what exactly is going on. But there's very little that these people can do. At the end of the day, the best Ted Cruz can hope for in the future is to start voting against unreliable energy and starting to vote for reliable energy sources for his state in the future. But the problem that you have is it's like an embedded friggin' tick. When you start talking about these things, they have huge subsidies, which his state is benefiting from, and he's going to end up sitting there and acquiescing on everything associated with this wind energy thing, solely because his state really benefits from it because they get 20% of their energy from wind.
And that was something
his
we were
vacation
discussing
isn't
before
going to change that.
On the wind power. I do want to get to that before we get off of the before we finish up the show. The wind power that they the numbers that they're calling for on their best of times, they're hitting 60%. They're not even getting the numbers they say they want to get out of these systems. They're getting at best 60%. I mean, they're getting zero now, but
that's pretty normal though, right? That's kind of the thing that I was trying to talk to earlier. If you take a look at the EIA report, which I linked, when we start talking about wind and solar, both of them, come mid-January, which is when we have the most expensive or when we have the highest energy demand, is in the middle of winter, which we talked about earlier. These things drop from their peak efficiency and peak output of like 40% to pretty much somewhere, I think 30% for solar, and I think it's like 40% for wind. It drops from 30% to somewhere around 12, 36% to 12, so it's 1/3 of this solar output, and it drops to, again, 1/3-ish of wind output in the middle of winter. There's just not that much energy to go around if your energy is entirely dependent upon the weather. That's the reality of what we're dealing with. And when we start talking about these energy sources, when we don't allow them to, when we're not properly accounting for the backup infrastructure that they require, we end up paying the cost one way or the other. We're either going to pay for it out of pocket when the bill comes due, which we are now, or which those poor folks in Texas are now, or we're going to pay for it in terms of folks actually suffering in their homes because they can't heat them. I mean, like, think about how terrible it must be to be in Texas and not have food or water or heat or be able to prepare a decent meal. And that is what happens when you rely on unreliable energy sources. We're talking about turning entire nations into the third world because it makes us feel good at the end of the day.
And not only that, kind of locking them there because, your environmental regulations are more important than the human lives that are directly lost as a result of your dictatorial calls.
Well, you know what? Chuck Schumer was out there talking about blaming climate change for the freeze. And first off, you know what's really funny about that? Is, Obama's advisor, his science czar back in 2009, 2010, when we got the first major polar vortex, or at least whatever, when the first time the news media cared to highlight a polar vortex, they tried to claim that polar vortexes were caused by climate change. Problem is, there is zero science that actually supports that. Now you have Chuck Schumer trying to do the same thing. The bottom line is, we should be building our energy infrastructure. We should be building not just our energy infrastructure, but our entire infrastructure to be resilient against all of these weird attacks, rather than building it for the off chance that maybe if we pull enough levers, the man behind the curtain will stop sitting there and screwing us over. I see no reason why we sit there and...
We should also not be selling any of that infrastructure to China, just as another by-the-by.
Yeah. You know what? China Biden's got a Chiden.
Right. Well, the Batacap Gary isn't going to pay for itself.
That is true. That is true. And those Uyghur Muslims, they we can't criticize what's happening there because that, different cultural norms and all that.
Well, yeah, death camps are just a part of their cultural tradition over there. So who are we to question that? I mean, are we trying to be some kind of imperialist, just saying, hey, you can't go have your concentration camps. Those aren't cool in the current year. You know, they're China. They have, they've got their own traditions. If they want to harvest an organ here and there from an unwilling, prisoner of conscience, that's on them.
Now, how do you know that they're unwilling? But China says that they're very willing. They're perfectly okay with their situation.
Oh, yeah. Who am I to question their narrative as well? I mean, what am I, some sort of Western imperialist?
That's exactly right. Damn colonialist.
Here I am, gentrifying the airwaves.
You are being too white in this time. That is what we've learned.
Burn my red man blood. It burns in my veins because of that white blood in there. It's a constant fight in my soul.
You know what I was actually sad about? I did my genetic testing, and so I come from New England, and when we sit there and we mock Pocahontas for her Pocahontas beliefs, to be fair to her, right? Almost, and I'm referring to Elizabeth Warren for those who don't know. So almost everybody who works or operates or lives in New England claims Native American heritage. It is literally a part of our culture, and it is assumed. I did my genetic test, and I had none. And do you know how upset I was? Because I have, from genealogical tales, Native American ancestor of the was Blackfoot tribe and all this other stuff that came on my grandmother's side.
Well, yeah, I have some good news and some bad news for you. A lot of the genetic testing resources, they genuinely lack a lot of the Native American bloodline resources. So what they do have is largely drawn from Latin and Aztec lines. So a lot of the actual Native American tribes just don't show up. So you really do have to do the genealogy to really know if you're an American Indian Native. It's better.
Really?
Actually, it's better in Canada, but here in North America, well, not North America, in the United States specifically, because it's better in South America too, because they have those genetic banks. They just kind of don't exist. So we really can't know without legitimately doing the genealogy. I mean, you can, but the gene banks just kind of aren't there to know. So it might be worth your while to actually contact the tribes and do the real deal genealogy.
You know, my wife handles that. So I don't know if I told you, but my wife discovered that her father, while her father is her father's father is not her grandfather. So I don't know if I told you that story. That was a fun thing that also came up while he was attempting to explain to me how nuclear reactions worked. My father-in-law also was. It was a day in which my father-in-law discovered that his father wasn't really his father. So my wife's done a lot of genealogy research, and then she did a genetic test and found there were certain portions of it that didn't match. And so she isolated where that portion came from, and it turns out that her grandfather is most likely an individual who was very active in her father's life, but not the individual who was. So her grandfather, the story that I've heard since I started dating her, was that her grandfather was a drunk and he was never around. Well, it turns out that's not her real grandfather. Her real grandfather was the individual who hung around with her grandmother whenever her father was not in town because he was drunk in a hotel somewhere. And it turns out that matches with the DNA test. So when she turned around and she's trying to figure out how to broach this with her father, that her dad's dad was not really his dad. Like that's a tough conversation to have.
Like, hey,
right?
Dad, I want to tell you something that you may not know.
Surprise! You're a bastard. In the literal sense. Right? No, so it turns out that he's like, oh, was it this guy? So he actually kind of knew and kind of suspected the whole time.
Huh.
And apparently, like, we were sitting there at Thanksgiving dinner, or what was Christmas dinner. And so he has his brother there. Person, I'll just use that term because that's how they were raised, right?
Yeah.
And he turns around and goes, you know, Jerry, they're sitting there and telling me that Dad wasn't my real dad. And Jerry's like, yeah? And you're like, oh, so everybody kind of knew but you, huh?
One of those.
That's kind of shitty.
Oh, man.
Then he tried to sit there and be like, well, if your mother was unfaithful, then that wouldn't match up. And Robin's like, nope. And Robin's my wife. Robin's like, nope, no, that's not how that works. See, I can trace this genetic lineage here, but this portion. What was it? It was she's heavily Polish, right? So her exact words were that she can find all of her Polish heritage, but none of that French Canadian associated with her last name.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a funny world.
Well, it was entertaining. I was entertained.
Well, it's always good to cut on a good note, and we've had a lot to discuss this week. And nothing else we really need to go over right now that's pressing. Although there is a chance of an extra because, we missed the last week, and I may try and get something special in here during the middle of the week for everybody. But no promises. Anyway, I'm Evan. That's been Steve. And, look him up at Ratman720. Basically, most places, alt tech stuff and all that. Look me up at that fake guy Dan. Anything else you want to say before we go?
No, I will say that I significantly missed tuning in last week while you suffered in your Hoboken hole of the middle of the country that doesn't matter as much as New York.
Well, it is what it is. But I have power now, and my kitty cats are warm, so I'm happy. Anyway.
Oh, you have kitty cats? I didn't know you had kitty cats.
Oh, yeah. I take care of some neighborhood cats.
Oh.
Well, okay, yeah, I'll leave.
Crazy cat lady.
I'm not a lady.
I don't assume your gender.
Well, you can, actually, because I'm, what is it? I'm apparently a misogynist or whatever, so that's fine.
That's good. That's good.
But yeah, no, I actually do look after some neighborhood cats. I built them some houses outside, and when the power went out, I've got heated pads for them in there so that, they don't freeze during the winter, and it also gives me a place that I can put water for them that won't freeze when it gets too cold overnight. I had to insulate those, so they had little cat igloos, I guess.
My wife's aunt and uncle did the same thing. They ended up collecting quite a herd.
Well, we've got a local program here, so I can take them to one of the local vets, and there's a government grant so that they can get them spayed and neutered, get them their initial shot.
Oh, that's actually really good. That's a good thing. So anybody who's ever thought about doing that, that's actually a really good program, because cats are havoc on the environment, and B, they face an overpopulation problem, unlike almost anything else. Nobody really wants to buy an older cat, so anybody who gets tired of their cat and or passes away ends up basically dumping their cats on shelters. So I fully support spay and neuter programs to help them live their best life.
Well, it really does. If you can find one like mine where they'll release it back into the local neighborhood, if you're willing to go to the effort of taking care of them, it's a good thing to do. And, it'll really just kind of make the world a little bit better place. And as they say, be the change you want to see in the world. So I think that's an even better place to leave off. So everybody,
that is a great place to leave off. I thoroughly respect that. That is a great place to be.
So if you're cold, they're cold, and you don't necessarily have to let them in, but do something about it. It all counts. So talk to you all again soon. Be well.